I had no idea that the CIA was basically behind the creation of using the internet as like a means to overthrow governments in other countries. All of the mainstream media outlets created by veterans of the State Department or the War Department.
I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic. And we are unapologetically outspoken.
Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. We hope you guys had a great weekend. And last week, we did our episode on Wednesday about the sheer ridiculousness of the Trump trials. And during that episode, I played a clip from Jesse Waters talking about that mysterious binder that's being alluded to by Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger. And when Jesse was first talking in the clip, he was giving a brief history of the CIA and talking about how President Eisenhower had assigned Allen Dulles to be the first civilian director of the CIA in the 1950s. And like his whole job was to eliminate communism. And it was under Dulles that the CIA basically became the government's most powerful three-letter agency. And it was essentially made up of like ruthless assassins whose whole job was to protect capitalism from big bad Russia. And within a few months of being in office, Dulles orchestrated Operation PB, which was where the CIA was involved in a coup to take over Guatemala's democratically elected leader and replace him with a military dictator. Why? To protect American corporate interests. And so when I played this clip, I was like, that's totally interesting, but it wasn't the focus of that episode. And I think I even said on the podcast, Stephanie, like, oh, I could have skipped the first minute or two of that clip because it was super long. But my point in using it was to give some background on the Russia collusion hoax and how this binder reportedly contains key evidence that was never uncovered during the investigation. So then a few days later, I'm listening to Tucker Carlson's podcast, and he does an interview with Mike Benz. And it was like a total holy shit moment for me because we talk about government corruption on this podcast all the time. And we talk about how all the three-letter agencies are basically corrupt as fuck, right? But I didn't realize how critical the history of the CIA is and its role in internet censorship. And to fully appreciate what's happening in America and around the world right now, we've decided to focus on that for part of this episode because it's seriously critical. So if you're not familiar with Mike Benz, he's a former State Department cybersecurity official. And he's the founder and executive director of Foundation for Freedom Online. And he was talking with Tucker last week about how the military industrial complex is basically what drives censorship and election interference in the United States, which we all know is the opposite of democracy. So that's not a surprising revelation. And we talk about that all the time. But like I said, I never fully grasped the history and the background of how the internet was basically created as a form of propaganda. So I want to start off by playing a clip from the beginning of their interview where Mike Benz is talking about how internet freedom turned into internet censorship. And it's kind of a long clip. It's about 5 minutes, so bear with us. But I honestly didn't know this shit. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of our listeners don't know either. And like I said, this is actually very important information that's only going to become more critical to be aware of as we get closer to November. So I want to play this clip from Tucker's podcast.
And so with that, here's Mike Benz, Executive Director of Foundation for Freedom Online. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. And I just can't overstate to our audience how exhaustive and comprehensive your knowledge is on this topic. It's almost unbelievable. And so if you could just walk us through how the foreign policy establishment and defense contractors and DOD and just the whole cluster, the constellation of defense-related, publicly funded institutions strip from us our freedom of speech.
Sure. One of the easiest ways to actually start the story is really with the story of internet freedom and its switch from internet freedom to internet censorship, because free speech on the internet was an instrument of statecraft almost from the outset of the privatization of the internet in 1991. We quickly discovered through the efforts of the Defense Department, the State Department, and our intelligence services that people were using the internet to congregate on blogs and forums. And free speech was championed more than anybody by the Pentagon, the State Department and our sort of CIA cutout NGO blob architecture as a way to support dissident groups around the world in order to help them overthrow authoritarian governments as they were sort of billed. Essentially, the internet free speech allowed kind of insta-regime change operations to be able to facilitate the foreign policy establishment's State Department agenda. Google is a great example of this. Google began as a DARPA grant by Larry Page and Sergey Brin when they were Stanford PhDs. And they got their funding as part of a joint CIA-NSA program to chart how, quote, birds of a feather flock together online through search engine aggregation. And then 1 year later, they launched Google and then became a military contractor quickly thereafter. They got Google Maps by purchasing a CIA satellite software, essentially. And the ability to use free speech on the internet as a way to circumvent state control over media in places like Central Asia or all around the world was seen as a way to be able to do what used to be done out of CIA station houses or out of embassies or consulates in a way that was totally turbocharged. And all of the internet free speech technology was initially created by our national security state. VPNs, virtual private networks, to hide your IP address. Tor, the dark web, to be able to buy and sell goods anonymously. End-to-end encrypted chats. All of these things were created initially as DARPA projects or as joint CIA-NSA projects to be able to help intelligence-backed groups to overthrow governments that were causing a problem to the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the Obama administration. And this plan worked magically from about 1991 until about 2014, when there began to be an about face on internet freedom and its utility. Now, the high watermark of the sort of internet free speech moment was the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, when you had this one by one, all of the adversary governments of the Obama administration, Egypt, Tunisia, all began to be toppled in Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions. And you had the State Department working very closely with the social media companies to be able to keep social media online during those periods. There was a famous phone call from Google's Jared Cohen to Twitter to not do their scheduled maintenance so that the preferred opposition group in Iran would be able to use Twitter to win that election. So it was free speech was an instrument of statecraft from the national security state to begin with. All of that architecture, all of the NGOs, the relationships between the tech companies and the national security state had been long established for freedom. In 2014, after the coup in Ukraine, there was an unexpected counter coup where Crimea and the Donbass broke away. And they broke away with essentially a military backstop that NATO was highly unprepared for at the time. They had one last Hail Mary chance, which was the Crimea annexation vote in 2014. And when the hearts and minds of the people of Crimea voted to join the Russian Federation, that was the last straw for the concept of free speech on the internet in the eyes of NATO. As they saw it, the fundamental nature of war changed at that moment. And NATO at that point declared something that they first called the Gerasimov Doctrine, which was named after this Russian military general who they claimed made a speech that the fundamental nature of war has changed. You don't need to win military skirmishes to take over Central and Eastern Europe. All you need to do is control the media and the social media ecosystem, because that's what controls elections. And if you simply get the right administration into power, they control the military. So it's infinitely cheaper than conducting a military war to simply conduct an organized political influence operation over social media and legacy media. An industry had been created that spanned the Pentagon, the British Ministry of Defense, and Brussels into a organized political warfare outfit, essentially infrastructure that was created, initially stationed in Germany and then Central and Eastern Europe, to create psychological buffer zones, basically to create the ability to have the military work with the social media companies to censor Russian propaganda or to censor domestic right-wing populist groups in Europe who were rising in political power at the time because of the migrant crisis. So you had the systematic targeting.
Okay. Stephanie, maybe I'm just being naive, but I had no idea that the CIA was basically behind the creation of using the internet as like a means to overthrow governments in other countries. Like, did you know this?
No, I didn't. But I have heard the conspiracy that the government basically started Google, like they gave Google the technology to become what it is so that they would have control over like the dominant company over communication. But also, I didn't think about this until I heard your intro when you were talking about Eisenhower, like helping to start the CIA. So there is a major conspiracy theory, and this conspiracy theory is so big that American Horror Story actually made a whole episode on it. But it has to do with Eisenhower, and they say that like the aliens or extraterrestrials or whatever they're calling them now, like interdimensional beings, whatever, gave Eisenhower this technology. And that's how like the internet came to be, and like basically how we've grown so quickly with technology since the 50s. So I had to throw that in there too, because it's like, hey, why not pull out the aliens? It's 2024. Like they're saying all kinds of crazy shit. So I'm gonna throw that conspiracy out there as well.
You know what? I bet at this point they're like, you guys really fucked this up and we can't fully take the technology back. So we're just going to push you towards creating AI so that they destroy you and the technology that you fucked up.
Right? Exactly. And it's like if aliens wanted to take over, I mean, hey, the internet would be a great way because that's how we connected the world, like in communication. So, I mean, pretty smart.
Exactly. But going back to this, like I when I was doing research for this episode, I was finding articles from like 2004, 2005. There was an article in CBS News from 2011. And even back then, they were talking about how social media is a tool of the CIA and that the CIA had been in bed with the world's largest ad agency network, which at the time was WPP. And like Mike Benz said, they've been doing social media data mining since at least January 2009. Google partnered with the CIA in 2004 when Google bought that mapping technology company called Keyhole that eventually became Google Earth. And then I think he mentioned this too. In 2010, Google and a company called InQtel made a joint investment on a company called Recorded Future that basically analyzes analytics on the web to create curves and like predict the outcome of events. And then totally irrelevant, like or irrelated, I was listening to Real AF the other day, and I don't even remember what they were talking about, but Andy brought up that, yeah, the CIA created the precursor to Facebook. And I can't remember what he said it was called. I think it was Lifebook or something like that. And I guess it wasn't super successful. But as soon as they took it down, Facebook went online the very next day. Like, that's a coincidence.
Right. And oh my gosh, like again, I didn't realize this until I hear you like reading this and like saying it out loud. But the company called Recorded Future that you said like analyzes analytics and predicts outcomes. Dude, Project Looking Glass. Remember we did a whole episode
Yes.
on that and we were like, everyone's like, oh, that's such a conspiracy theory. Like, you know, you can't predict the future. Hello, like right there. It's like
Yeah.
recorded. People are talking about it, but you call it something different and you say, oh, well, it's just analyzing analytics. That's how it can tell the future. That's freaking Project Looking Glass. Again,
I
another
didn't,
CIA project.
yeah, I didn't make that connection either. That's fucking crazy. And like also in that clip I just played, Benz mentions DARPA. So that's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And that's like the government agency that's responsible for developing tech. And the investment groups that funded Facebook were composed of venture capital firms like the one I mentioned, InQtel. And all of these firms have ties to national defense. There's like Dr. Anita Jones, who is the director of defense research and engineering for the US DoD. She was an advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and she oversaw DARPA. And she was involved in this whole Facebook deal, right? So, like, if you guys want to know more about this, you can go online. Like I said, there are tons of articles from the early 2000s that kind of go into detail on all this stuff. And so, like, everything that's going on right now relates to the CIA, their history of rigging elections around the world. One of the things Benz mentioned in his interview with Tucker was back in all the way back to like 1948, the CIA rigged the election in Italy by stuffing ballot boxes and partnering with the mob. And the whole reason they did this was like to prevent communism. But I want to play one more clip, and that's going to bring this full circle to where we are now. And I promise this clip is like much shorter than the first one that I played. If I can log into my phone, which just locked me out. Okay, here we go.
Published a memo called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare, where he said, listen, it's a mean old world out there. We at the CIA just rigged the Italian election. We had to do it because if the communists won, maybe there'd never be another election in Italy again. So, but it's really effective, guys. We need a Department of Dirty Tricks to be able to do this around the world. And it's essentially a new social contract we're constructing with the American people, because this is not the way we've conducted diplomacy before. But we are now forbidden from using the War Department. In 1948, they also renamed the War Department to the Defense Department. So again, as part of this diplomatic onslaught for political control, rather than it looking like it's overt military control. But essentially what ended up happening there is we created this foreign domestic firewall, we said, that we have a Department of Dirty Tricks to be able to rig elections, to be able to control media, to be able to meddle in the internal affairs of every other plot of dirt in the country. But this sort of sacred dirt on which the American homeland sits they are not allowed to operate there. The State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA are all expressly forbidden from operating on U.S. soil. Of course, this is so far from the case, it's not even funny, but that's because of a number of laundering tricks that they've developed over 70 years of doing this. But essentially, there was no moral quandary at first with respect to the creation of the censorship industry when it started out in Germany and in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and in Sweden and Finland. There began to be a more diplomatic debate about it after Brexit. And then it became full throttle when Trump was elected. And what little resistance there was washed over by the rise and saturation of Russiagate, which basically allowed them to not have to deal with the moral ambiguities of censoring your own people. Because if Trump was a Russian asset, you no longer really had a traditional free speech issue. It was a national security issue. It was only after Russiagate died in July 2019, when Robert Mueller basically choked on the stand for 3 hours and revealed he had absolutely nothing after 2.5 years of investigation, that the foreign to domestic switcheroo took place, where they took all of this censorship architecture spanning DHS, the FBI, the CIA, the DOD, the DOJ, and then the thousands of government-funded NGO and private sector mercenary firms were all basically transited from a foreign predicate, a Russian disinformation predicate, to a democracy predicate by saying that disinformation is not just a threat when it comes from the Russians, it's actually an intrinsic threat to democracy itself. And so by that, they were able to launder the entire democracy promotion regime change toolkit just in time for the 2020 election.
I mean, it's almost beyond belief that this has happened. I mean, my own father worked for the U.S.
Okay. So why was this mind-blowing for me, right? Because, okay, if we look at the pivotal year of 2016, on one hand, you had what was happening in Europe. He mentioned Brexit. And if you don't know what that is, that's when the UK decided to withdraw from the European Union. And so Benz was talking about how there was this fear not only of like Russian propaganda spreading from Eastern Europe into the West via the internet, but there was also the fear of propaganda from other countries trying to do what the UK did and create their own Brexit-style movements in Europe, which would put NATO and the EU at risk, right? So NATO starts putting out propaganda about how the biggest threat isn't invasion from Russia, it's losing domestic elections across Europe to right-wing populist groups of like working class people, because they were all campaigning for cheap Russian energy. And at the same time, you have the US and NATO that are pushing for energy diversification, which, Stephanie, when you think about it, this was probably like the start of the whole manufactured climate crisis, climate alarmist movement, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is when it was decided by the global elites that the military had to step in and take over media to prevent the disintegration of the EU and NATO, because if that happened, There would be no more enforcement arm for the International Monetary Fund if the EU and NATO were dissolved, and the World Bank and quote democracy would collapse if people got their way and countries had like actual legitimate elections. And so this is all happening at the same time that in the United States, we're having our 2016 elections, and they didn't fucking think Trump was going to win, but he did. And this is at the same time social media started to become more popular than the MSM. And speaking of which, Stephanie, another thing I didn't know before listening to this interview was like all of the mainstream media outlets like ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, etc. They were all of them created by veterans of the State Department or the War Department after World War II. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know they were created that way, but I did know that they got their scripts from the government because of Project Mockingbird. So it makes sense that they were started by the State Department, but I want to throw something in here, and I didn't have time to really like fully dive into this, but I heard Mike Benz, he went on the Morning Wire podcast this morning as at the time of our recording. So I listened to this like right before we started recording, and he talks about CISA as well. So this is another alphabet agency. It's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This was actually created in 2018 under the Trump administration. And so remember how like back then everything was like Russia, 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 like Russia, you know? And so the reason it was created was to start looking into, okay, we know that there was some interference in the elections. So we're going to look into it to make sure there's no foreign entities like Russia that are interfering. That was like the whole gist behind it. And that agency has basically gone rogue. And so it was supposed to be started to look at foreign interference and censor foreign like adversaries. Well, flat out, like in Congress, they have changed it since to be like 80% domestic censorship and only like 20% foreign. And so it's both the Democrats and the Republicans that are voting for this. It's the freaking uniparty. And so they asked him on the podcast today, well, if this was under the Trump administration, is Trump complicit? Like, did he know this was happening, or was he just not aware? And he said that he doesn't think that they knew what this would turn into. And so like it started out with good intentions and then it like went rogue. So that like brings us to today because it's still going on. And we know with the Twitter files, like to a great extent, but it's like this other agency, CISA, that is like totally censoring the American people, and they're not even trying to hide it. I mean, they're talking about this in Congress. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's insane. And it's like, if you look at all of these mainstream media outlets, right? Realistically, none of them were actually ever true independent journalism because we've clearly been told what they wanted us to know since these news outlets were all basically created by the government. So then you throw social media into the mix via the internet, which again was supposed to be created like CISA for their own use so that they could monitor and control the world and rig elections with the help of the CIA and foreign interference. And like, so instead, it becomes this ability for anyone to communicate basically uncensored. Anyone can speak out on multiple platforms. They're capable of worldwide reach, not just in your own country. And at first, it wasn't really censored like the MSM because the elites in control never thought it would grow to the extreme that it has. But then when social media started becoming more popular than mainstream, it basically threatened the entire international world order that was being carefully constructed and held in place by who? By the United States, NATO, and the European Union, with over 70 years of unified foreign policy. So when people started to question the narrative through, widespread reach on social media, this obviously becomes a huge threat to the military industrial complex and particularly US intelligence services because they were losing control of the narrative and in turn, their version of national security. And when you consider all the COVID censorship that destroyed like millions of lives and tore families apart and all the manufactured racism and all the other crazy shit that we've been dealing with over the past few years, what's the one thing that's kept people informed? It's not the fucking MSM, right? Even with the campaigns of disinformation and misinformation on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Google and people have still been able to get the truth out on other platforms like TikTok and X and through podcasts, right? So the reason that this was so mind-blowing to me to finally put all the pieces together after listening to this podcast is because this is the absolute most critical year that will define the future of our country. And we keep saying that over and over again. And if they being the elites, cannot maintain control of the narrative on the internet and social media through censorship, and if the misinformation, disinformation campaigns aren't successful, what do you think they're going to do next? Like, realistically, the most viable option is to what? Shut the whole thing down, right?
Bingo. Yep. And it's not even just our country. We've talked about it before, like all the elections in the world that are up. And look at like Italy, El Salvador, Argentina, like they're seeing all these different countries are going more conservative and right wing. So like they're probably panicking. So this brings me to what happened at the end of last week. And Tara, I know you're not in the United States right now. But I let you know that on Thursday, millions of Americans woke up to no cell phone connection. And many had found that their phone had switched from like, you know, how it's in like 5G or 2G or whatever, it switched to SOS mode. So that caused a lot of panic. Like people were calling 911 and it wouldn't go through. And then like in the areas where it would go through, 911 operators said that like so many people kept calling in and they were asking, you know, is there some sort of national emergency because we have this SOS message on our phone? And Tara, like just hearing that, doesn't it sound a lot like the Obama produced movie that we talked about, Leave the World Behind?
Just a little.
Yep, because that's exactly how the movie started. They didn't have internet and it was like the internet, you know, went out, but they didn't really like think anything of it. And then their phones go into SOS mode and then, you know, the story just progresses from there. So according to Morning Wire, AT&T and their subsidiary Cricket experienced a massive outage. But here's the thing, just about every other cell phone provider had some outages as well. And it seemed to hit Dallas, Raleigh, Houston, Nashville, and San Francisco the hardest. So AT&T was saying, "Oh, this wasn't a malicious attack. It was just due to a software update." Okay, well, that doesn't explain why, number one, all these other providers had the problem. But number two, why are the FTC, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the White House all launching investigations into this if it was just a software update? You know, like it doesn't explain all these other things. And so, of course, there's like all these different theories going around because our government is never transparent in this administration. So one theory going around was that it was caused by solar flares that emitted radiation. And I know you talked about this on an episode before, Tara, but NASA said there were like two major solar flares that happened late Wednesday. But NASA said the flares would have only affected the Eastern Hemisphere. And according to Dr. Ryan French of the Solar Observatory, he said the solar flares was just a coincidence and like this had nothing to do with the cell phone outage. So what got my attention, what were you going to say something?
Mm-mm.
Oh,
No.
what got my attention is on X, Don Jr., Trump's son, posted, quote, "Does anyone believe this was a solar flare? Next, they'll tell us the stars aligned in retrograde or some crap, which made it worse. LOL. At this point, if you don't have a hard time believing anything the government is telling you, you must be living under a rock."
But this is like, okay, what? The full moon was on Saturday, right? What are they going to
Uh-huh.
say? That this was like setting up for the full moon?
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, we get into all the astrology stuff too, but if you guys don't follow him, Don Jr., like he is freaking hilarious. Like you will laugh every single day. But anyhow, so he posts that and it caught my attention because I'm like, you know what? I would think he would know. I think that Trump knows a hell of a lot more than he revealed about like space and solar events. I mean, he said as much that he wishes he could tell us more. And I think that's why he created Space Force, and maybe he knows that NASA is like a total bullshit cover for laundering money, which is a whole rabbit hole that we will go down another day. And it's a deep one. But when Don Jr. calls bullshit on solar flares, like he's got my attention. And then we have Elon Musk, another person that I would think would know about solar flares. And he wrote on X, quote, "This is a test," end quote. Makes you wonder, right? This is a test. Okay, well, what does that mean? So I'm not sure if we talked about this before on the podcast, but Elon Musk is the biggest private contractor that works for the government for like everything he does at SpaceX. So like if anyone were to know what the hell happened on Thursday, it would be him. And I really don't know what to think about him. Like my gut tells me he's a good guy that truly wants free speech and the truth. But knowing he's tied in with like the government leads me to believe like maybe he is paid opposition or something. So I don't know. Like, do you think he was giving us a little Easter egg, letting us know, okay, hey, they're testing you, like something big is coming? Or do you think he's just like stirring the pot?
Well, I'm with you on the whole Elon Musk thing because, yes, not only is he like the biggest government contractor, he's a leader in this whole AI revolution, right? On one hand,
Mhm.
he's telling us about the dangers of AI while he's still creating all of these crazy robots and
Yep.
AI technology. So I have a hard time like reconciling where I stand with him.
Right. Yeah. And then we have like what happened not that long ago, where FBI Director Christopher Wray warned that the CCP corporate proxies were targeting infrastructure and phone companies to take them down. And we know China has launched that like Vault Typhoon, which was that cyber operation aimed at like ports and gas pipelines and other infrastructure sites. And then you have Senator Marco Rubio, and he posted on X, "I don't know the cause of the AT&T outage, but I do know it will be 100 times worse when China launches a cyber attack on America on the eve of a Taiwan invasion. And it won't be just cell service they hit. It will be your power, your water, and your bank," end quote. So my question is, are these legitimate warnings or are they just like priming us? It's like psychology, like they're conditioning us for something that our own government is plotting. Because I do not trust Marco Rubio whatsoever. Like I know he's a Republican, I know he's from Florida, but my spidey senses go off with him. So for what it's worth, I take everything he says with a grain of salt. But like here's where my conspiracy brain is going with this, okay? What are the odds that in an election year, the biggest election year, like we've talked about, we're experiencing massive cell phone outages? Like, I really want everyone listening to put your thinking caps on here, okay? In all of the years that we have had cell phones, it just so happens that in the most important election of modern history, this happens. Like, use common sense. We have better cell phone service, more towers, better phones, faster internet, 5G, fiber optic cables. But now is when we have a massive outage, not in 1995 or Y2K or like when we had those big clunky phones and like no cell phone towers anywhere, right? So, like, this leads me to believe that it absolutely is like some type of a cyber attack. It seems pretty damn obvious. But the question is, who's the attacker? Right? So, like, according to our government, the CCP is most likely. And yeah, probably. But again, my conspiracy brain goes elsewhere because think about it. Like, how many times have we said that the powers that be have made it crystal clear that they will stop at nothing to make sure that Trump never gets back in the White House? Like we know, we're fully expecting them to do something. Then in an election year, this administration that's been so soft on China for the past 3 years is all of a sudden now they're going to be transparent with the American people and say, oh, no, 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 the CCP is doing cyber attacks. Like,
Yeah,
it's a
we'll
little
let their
weird, right?
we'll let their spy balloons travel over the country for days and
Right?
not give a shit. But
Oh, it's
now they're
just a
doing
weather
cyber
balloon.
attacks.
It's a weather
Yeah,
balloon. But now they've been attacking us for like, what did they say? Like 5 years or something. And like, we
yeah.
just now are finding out about it. So, like, would they benefit? Who, like, you got to ask yourself, who would benefit from a cyber attack in an election year? The American government. And like, would the CCP? I mean, yes, in a way, but also we purchase a lot from them. So like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's looking a little fishy here. And so is this just a test or like a warning of a much bigger attack that's coming? I believe so. Just like Elon Musk said. I think they primed us again. It's like you got to go back to psychology, and if you understand anything about the subconscious mind, it understands a lot more than you do consciously, and they prime us in the media with things that are coming so we don't flip out and revolt. And so I think that Christopher Wray's announcement with like the CCP attacking, our infrastructure and our phone infrastructure was them priming us. And then they do like this, this little attack on one day to kind of see how we react. They're testing it out. They're seeing if they can get away with it. They're seeing if we're going to blame China or solar flares or whatever. And then I see like two possible scenarios. So it's like closer to the election, they take down service, declare a national emergency, and just make it impossible to vote. Or this opens up an opportunity to say that, well, due to a cyber attack, there was actually election interference, and that prevents Trump from taking office because they say like, oh, they hacked into our elections or something, So like with everything we just heard from Mike Benz on Tucker, like, does this really seem so far-fetched that it's our own government?
No, and you know what just came to my mind while you were talking, and I was thinking like, okay, we've talked before about how all of these elites and power players are building their private bunkers.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it has nothing to do with an attack from the outside. Maybe it has to do with when the American people riot after finding out that it's our own government that's fucking us, which we already know. But when it becomes like widespread knowledge that it's our government that's responsible for all of these, quote, foreign attacks. So now they all have their little underground cities
Yeah.
where they can live. Like,
Or maybe because they know if Trump becomes president, they're all like done, like I don't know. That's a really good point though. Like it very well could be that they're going to hide out because they know shit's going to hit the fan. Maybe they use that little predictor tool that analyzes statistics and can predict the future, and they know they're fucked no matter how much they try to stop it. Like the truth is coming out.
and that's the thing. It's like the government can, you look at this throughout history, any fucking country. It may take 50 years, 100 years, but every government gets toppled at some point because when enough people are over it and enough people revolt, there's a regime change. And so now we have evidence that the CIA has been controlling every government's regime change for the last 70 years. And if you don't pay attention to the news, like you don't see what's happening around the world. There's so much fucked up shit going on in America right now. But again, being in Europe, I get news articles all the time about things going on here. And we talked about this with all these trucker protests. They're having them in the Czech Republic now. They just had a massive farming protest in Prague over the weekend with like hundreds, maybe it was thousands of these tractors in the streets, just like in Germany, just like in France, just like in Spain. And so you have all of these factions of the working class who are sick of their country's government structure. And I just feel like the only way that's really left for the government to maintain control is they're either going to have a massive like civil wars within countries where it's the people against the military industrial complex, or world wars, or what's the easy way to do this without that much bloodshed? You fucking shut down the internet.
Right. Because people will go into panic mode and like you're worried about just feeding your family, keeping your family safe instead of like revolting or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And all I know, like what happened on Thursday, I think everyone should take that as a warning call. It's like, did you
Yeah.
wake up on Thursday thinking like, oh, this is the day. This is the day where it all goes down? Because I sure as fuck wasn't prepared, And it's like, this outage was only a small portion of the US for a few hours. What would you do if it affected the entire US for days or weeks or months?
Yeah, you can't get any information. You can't
Yeah,
talk to family members. You have no
right,
idea. You don't even know what's going on 10 miles from your house,
right,
right? You have
right.
no fucking clue.
Yeah. So it's like if you're one of those people that is laughing at like preparing and stocking up on essentials, now would be the time to like take it seriously because hello, like it's right here in our face. They're showing us what can happen. And it's a serious threat. And next time it will probably hit us much harder. And just like Rubio said, like I don't trust the guy, but like what if it did affect the water supply or electricity? So it's like you got to think about these things and start making some preparations for like how are you going to get through that time with your family and stay safe and have everything you need. And so I want to take it. Go ahead.
I was gonna say too, like, how many people even have a landline anymore?
I don't.
I don't.
I don't even
I haven't
know.
had one.
Like, I didn't even know you could still get a landline. Honestly, like,
I haven't
like,
had one for years.
right. Exactly. Just like little basic things like that. And so, okay, going back to the Obama produced movie, Leave the World Behind. Okay. So, like, what are the odds that this exact scenario was how that movie started? Again, it's like tying it back to that, like with the SOS messages on the phones and the cell phone outages, and what ended up being in that movie in the end, right? They made it look like it was an outside threat, but then it was revealed that it was actually an inside job. It was our own government that caused it. So you couple that with everything that Mike Benz revealed, and I would say that this was an inside job. And with the election coming up, we can expect a wild ride. Like,
Yep.
are you with me on that? What do you think?
100%.
Yeah. So it's like, pay attention. They're priming us for something. Be prepared. Just be prepared. It's like, we got to take this shit seriously. And again, like they will do whatever it takes to make sure that Trump does not get in the White House. So every day he gets more and more popular. He just won South Carolina. So it's going to amp up. And just think about that. Like, start stocking up on stuff. I saw one girl on TikTok. She's like, if you're paying your fucking taxes this year, you're an idiot. I was like dying laughing. I'm like, oh my God. So yeah, 2024 is shaping up to be a wild year.
Yeah.
So, okay, since we had a doomsday episode, we decided that we will come back on Wednesday with a fun one. Okay, so just like stick with us. We're going to try and balance out the doomsday stuff with maybe more doomsday stuff, but at least it'll be like fun to talk about and like kind of funny and we can laugh at it. So,
yeah.
Anyhow, we'll see you guys back here. Thank you so much for tuning in and have a great day. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.